Now, I think when we talk about, and this is, I think, why we're here for these 3 sessions, why bother with the doctors? Isn't there a way, I mean, doctors contribute so much anyhow. Isn't there a way to do it without them? But if you really look seriously at the benefits, you can see why there's no working around. Certainly, they have unique knowledge and experience that they contribute when they are engaged in improvement efforts. And certainly when I'm involved, I have a greater commitment to the solutions, especially if my involvement is going to be required for successful implementation. If I'm involved, I have a much more realistic sense of what the current state is and the need for improvement, as well as the interaction among the parts and what kinds of solutions are possible, probably appreciating it's nothing simple. And certainly if I'm involved, I'm going to have greater ownership over whatever this quality agenda will be. And then I also developed greater trust with all the people that I've collaborated with to come up with a solution. So for all these reasons, there's really many benefits. It's not a minor list. But now for the challenges. And there's a series of ways in which I think the challenges present themselves. First of all, when we talk about engaging doctors, it's usually doctors and managers coming together, bringing ideally their expertise to share to come up with solutions which are going to improve things in the trust. Well, but the initial problem is that we see the world so fundamentally differently. Our socialization and the ways of working and what we view as priorities are often quite different. Not right or wrong, but different. Blended create a perfect situation. But if we don't blend and if we're kind of looking for others to be like us, as opposed to really appreciating the differences, we can end up really feeling pretty frustrated. And there on that list on that slide, you can see, I mean, your doctors, and I know this is a generalization, but it tend to focus on individuals. They want rapid solutions because often they're dealing with emergent situations. They want to know what's right or wrong, what's going to work or not work, with low tolerance for ambiguity, certainly. And certainly if this is all about saving money or making things more efficient, still we find many doctors who don't necessarily see that as their issue. They're there to treat patients as best they can. I suspect that things have changed some, but I think that's still there in part. They tend to be very loyal to one place and spend their entire career in one place. Whereas managers, I think, rather than the individual, are looking at populations, and they rarely spend time with individual patients. They have a longer-term outlook, and certainly they work with problems which are very complex and where there are political agendas, and there's no quick, simple solution. And for them, the issue of cost and economics is really critical to their success professionally, as well as to the success and longevity of the trust. And they tend to, if their idea is successful, the way they're rewarded in their own career is to move on fairly frequently. It's very, very different. And these different worldviews in the next slide tend to contribute to what I'll call a wobbly relationship, where you have these fragile, distrustful relationships. People aren't on the same page. Skepticism, and certainly each takes actions, managers and doctors, that are perceived by the others to be out of self-interest. And so the end result, and I hate to be so grim, but this is typically what I see, we have well-intentioned and well-trained people, but when you put those differences together, what you end up with really is very shallow, with what I would call a pool of goodwill, very shallow. And so these poor relationships then erode rather than build the willingness of doctors to engage, because again, it undermines trust. Now, how did we get this way? I think it's interesting because it doesn't really matter how we got this way, but the power of the way we are today is like a dance. And in that next slide, I mean, the metaphor here is that when we're in a dance, we're in a dynamic. One gives to the other, and it's all quite predictable if we're doing our steps correctly, how the dance will turn out. And it's interactive, but it's quite predictable. And I think when you have patterns of behavior over time, we don't necessarily take steps in that dance to be constructive, but they're almost on automatic pilot. And so often the result of that dance gets us to the same place, which is not opening up real communication, not feeling that we are valued, either of us are respected, and so we end up back to where we were. So we need to be conscious, really, really conscious of the dance. And if you look at the next slide where it says examples, I would ask you to read those after we're off today, but I think it's very typical kinds of ways in which we reinforce our preconceived notions of each other. And so then the question is, why bother? Because we know how it's going to turn out. Do we know how it's going to turn out, or is it we are all on automatic pilot, almost playing our parts in a play? And I think that's often what happens. There's one other dynamic here I think that gets into the situation, and that is, I said earlier that we have different senses for what engagement is all about, how we would define it. That's why I wanted to define it at the beginning. If you look at managers on their part, they often do have very different definitions of what engagement looks like, and they don't not so sure if they ask for your input whether or not they're handing over control, which for them could be, if there's pressure on them to come up with a rapid solution, they hesitate to then give that over, waiting for consensus of a group of doctors. The need for timely decisions certainly makes a lengthy process very difficult, and perhaps even very successful managers in their careers have not had much success in engaging doctors in a way where they felt there was value for the time spent. I'm not saying there wouldn't be, but that may be their experience. And the doctor's part, they can often be cynical that their input doesn't really make any difference, and they're giving their input into a black hole. And this reluctance to delegate authority, even physician leaders, never mind working with managers, no one can really speak for them. And so there's a sense that everybody needs to speak for themselves. And when you have an individual speaking for themselves, that kind of engagement really isn't all that useful, because who then can make and keep commitments on the part of the clinicians? Certainly the clinicians will talk about many other demands they have, maybe better use for their time as they see it. And then if they see colleagues, after something has been successfully selected, if they see colleagues choosing not to do the new way, and there's no real consequences for that, then there's another reason to feel reinforced for why bother. It doesn't really pay off. So there, again, these different experiences and experience with engagement tends to, I think, oftentimes turn people off. So it will take a change in the dynamic. And this is important. When we talk about improving this engagement and all the benefits would accrue if we could, we're not talking about something simple like buy the doctor's lunch. If the doctors aren't engaged, okay, one question you have to ask is, have they been allowed to opt out? And if not allowed to opt out, we haven't surfaced the real problem. If we said this is something that's required, then we'd hear the reasons why it's not worth doing, and perhaps we'd get to the bottom of it. But we can kind of get out very easily because, if I don't do it, nobody really says much about it. Are the clinical leaders in post, are they respected and able to speak for the doctors? And do they foster engagement and improvement? And there are many reasons that that's not the case. It's not about people necessarily. It may be that the jobs are not clear. It may be that sometimes these people have been in post for a long time and haven't gotten performance feedback either from their colleagues or from the trust. And so oftentimes the clinical leaders are really left in a very difficult situation. I mean, you look at the managers, and they say they want doctors involved, and I'm sure at some level they do, but I wonder if they would think maybe when it's in a narrow place and maybe not in ways in which doctors would really see a sincere effort being made. But the bottom line is, if we are going at the end of all this conversation to come up with something which will really improve the state of affairs in your trust, the bottom line is that higher levels of engagement means we all change, all. Doctors change, managers change, we all change. And in a way that's kind of good news, because if everybody said, okay, this is the party that has to change and everybody else gets to stand around and watch, that would never work, and it absolutely isn't true. We all bring certain wonderful traits to what would make for collaborative efforts and engagement and improvement, but we also all have some patterns which probably are not so functional. So I think what's really important then at this point is to think a little bit in summarizing, okay, the nature of the problem, because we're going to open this up for some questions and comments in just a moment, but right now I want to talk about everything that I've said leads us to think about, so what's the change, the kind of change we're talking about? And on the next slide, and this I think is a critical thing to just contemplate for a moment. On the next slide, you'll see the work of some people at the Harvard School of Government who have worked on change in large, complex, not-for-profit organizations. And the people there have come up with a taxonomy, which I think is very useful, and others have found it useful as well. They talk about two kinds of changes. There are technical changes and adaptive changes. Technical changes, you have a very well-defined problem. There's a solution. The implementation is clear. It's very straightforward. But when we're dealing with adaptive change, it's complex. We have to, if we're going to be successful in implementing this kind of change, we have to transform long-standing habits and deeply held assumptions and values as who does what in the job, what's the pecking order here, what is it, if I think this is what engagement means, then this is what engagement means. We don't share power here. All the things that really would be required to be successful, many of them really are involving transforming long-standing habits and deeply held assumptions. And that's a really pivotal thing to think about. It's deep stuff. It's not simple. It involves feelings of loss and sacrifice. And I've alluded to some of those already this morning, today. The solution certainly requires learning and new ways of thinking, new relationships, feeling perhaps insecure after having worked many years in a certain way that felt very secure and dependable. But here's the other thing about adaptive change, and this is the most crucial element of all. If you are dealing with adaptive change, the people who are being asked to behave differently have to come up with a solution. If people are asked to give up what's important to them, no matter how good your solution is, they will reject it because it doesn't fit already the thing that they think is working pretty well for them. So we have to create the environment where people want to engage, and they see the advantages of engaging as far greater than the advantages of the status quo. Just real quickly before we go to the questions, if you look at the slide there of the picture there of the iPhone, that's a technical change, very straightforward, no angst. It easily integrates into daily life, and it's pretty intuitive. Whereas if you go to the next slide, when you look at the surgical safety checklist for WHO, and I would suspect that many of you in your trust, this is going on in operating rooms today, but if you go to the next slide, I think this is an adaptive change. It may look very technical, paper and pencil ticking off the boxes, but if you think about it, we're really challenging existing patterns of behavior in what often is a status hierarchy in the operating theater. It's going to call for fundamentally different relationships. For example, one of the steps is confirm all have introduced themselves by name and role. That often in many trusts I know gets kind of ridiculed as unnecessary, but that's setting the tone. And if we don't do that, and it is highly adaptive, oftentimes we don't really do the next things, which are really pointing out the things that are not being hit on the checklist. But that requires technicians and nurses to give up some of the times in which they've done deferential kinds of relationships to really putting patient safety first and speaking up, and the surgeon really saying thank you if they are doing their job to try to make it safer for patients. This certainly represents several changes for the surgeons as well regarding their autonomy and sense of status. So these are adaptive changes that we're talking about. That dance that has to change, that's not a technical thing. That's about relationships. It's about giving up old patterns. So I think it's very important to name the nature of what we're dealing with and not look for superficial solutions when it really is a pretty profound thing that needs to change. And certainly, as I say, much of the quality improvement represents adaptive change. So I think at that point, I would like to go to the questions, because I think we have a lot of material, and I think we're going to be covering a little bit of this again in a future session. But I want to hear what people are thinking and what their questions and thoughts might be.
Okay, thanks very much, Jack. Alan Wilson is asking that you've given quite a clear picture of what the reality is for doctors and managers, but are nurses and other healthcare professionals similar to doctors, or are the issues specific to doctors?
I think that, because we're talking about traditions now, we're talking about giving up things which have really been seen as the rights of doctors, and I think, I certainly have not spent time in your country, but I have spent a lot of time in the UK and in Canada, and there I do think, it's the doctors think of themselves as having certain other privileges, because for many years they did. They're not making it up, they really did have those privileges. And so I think there's something about doctors where they feel a certain right to behave in ways that perhaps others would not see as appropriate, nor their right. But the thing is, if people are behaving in ways in which in the past were acceptable, and we make them immediately wrong for that, that's not going to be very useful in terms of getting them to be open to thinking about new ways of being. We can accept the way people are without approving of it, and then maybe perhaps go to then a different and better conversation. I think it's very important to remember, when we think about the way things have been, and therefore there's a reflection of that in the way things are today, we have all helped to create that. Surely there are doctors who perhaps had certain images of themselves which are no longer useful, but those very images were reinforced by managers for many years, and perhaps other professionals for many years. So I don't know if the doctors are the only ones, but I think it's important to acknowledge that they do come with a set of expectations, which I think are somewhat uniquely theirs.
Okay. How do we define in our healthcare system what the greater good is? And does this vary with the healthcare system you find yourself in and the underlying philosophy of that health system?
It's interesting. And I think you're speaking really to something that we will be talking about during these sessions, which is, in a sense, at least within an individual trust, that's got to be clear. What is the vision? How do we measure success? But I think when I look around the countries that I've worked in, I think we're all really being challenged by the same things, which is a growing, aging population, acknowledging that still many of the ways in which we treat people is not really making efficient use of resource. There's still repetitive things being done. We've hardly begun to really lasso or utilize the potential for carers and for patients themselves to be a part of the solution. Many of the same problems. So I think it really comes down to everywhere where I've been working, is getting people to really sit down and really ask some very fundamental questions. But while they're asking those fundamental questions about how could we be doing this more efficiently, safer, with having better resource to give patients better access, having a methodology also I think is very important for getting to that better place. So, because if we sit in a room, we just debate various points of view, that's not nearly as useful, I think, as if we have an approach for looking at something in a fairly analytic way and then testing and trying something and knowing that it will be generations of improvements which will ultimately get us to a better place. But I think it's looking for the better use of resources, providing safer, better access for patients, more coordinated care, more integrated care. Those are all the words that I'm hearing in California and everywhere I go in the States. And I think that's what I'm hearing as I read what's coming out in England. I think it's about, and the UK in general. I think it's very much everybody's job is to make that happen now.
So does that suggest that we need a certain amount of organisational readiness for that to change before we engage the clinicians? I
think it does. And one of the things I'll be talking about in the next session is how do we move from this state of, if people would agree that there's a fair amount of distrust, how do we get beyond that? Because we cannot build trust until we start making and keeping commitments to each other. You don't build trust by talking about it. But how do you get people even into a room to have a good, honest conversation if they feel that, well, why bother? It's not going to make a difference. So one of the things that I want to address in the next session is how do you begin to open that up so that then people will start to say what they think and in turn will begin to perhaps participate in a different way.
So what do you say to our doctor colleagues who insist they're too busy with patients to engage in management?
Well, I guess it comes down to this, and I think everyone's got to really look at the reality of the situation. I think someone put it this way. In today's world, whether we like it or not, really clinicians have two roles. They have two jobs. The job of seeing the patients on a day-to-day basis, and then the job of improving what it is that they do. And I think some people will have more of an inclination to do the figuring out than others, but if one is not figuring it out, I think that there's every reason for them to feel, therefore, even more obligation to then test and try out and ultimately to implement some changes once they've been seen to make things better. But to opt out completely from the creative process as well as from the kind of the need to implement, I think it's very frustrating to people because the benefits of all of this, the safety and the more efficient use of resource, comes when we can actually come to an agreement and all go together. And I recognize that's probably one of the biggest adaptive changes of all, when doctors have really been, I think, educated to think of their autonomy as something that goes along with their professional responsibilities comes autonomy. And I think there are aspects of autonomy which are very important to maintain, but there are aspects of autonomy which I think are keeping us stuck. And that's another adaptive change, really a critical examination of, in today's world, in modern healthcare today, what is the role of autonomy for clinicians? And where does it add value? And where does it perhaps just add complexity and cost and danger for patients? I think all of these philosophical questions are really critical because in many ways we are trying to create a fundamentally different way of providing health care. Doctors are central to that. So if we're changing all of this with the way doctors are working, their role, their need to work collaboratively with other people, these are awfully big questions, and I think we have to start to enlarge the discussion so we can begin to talk about some of these things.
Well, that leads nicely into the next question, which is would you see doctor-led quality improvements as a way to reduce irrational variation in medical practice? And is reducing the variation the underlying reason why doctor-led improvements are thought to be more effective than alternatives?
Well, I think clinician-led for that matter, but yes, I think we have to get to reducing this non-value-added variation because in industry after industry and in healthcare organizations that have gone far enough into it to see the evidence, it's the variation that creates complexity, excess cost, and danger for patients. I think people will often say, well, if we all do it the same way, so-called standard work, won't that stifle creativity? And I'm not the technical expert, but I do know many who are, and I believe what they say, which is until we can standardize the process and all do it one way, we can't measure how it performs, and therefore it becomes very difficult to improve because we have nothing where we can really measure where are we today. So the first step of improving it is standardizing it. Then if there are people who think they've got a better way, you can go off and actually do it in a planful, to get data, is it better? If it's better, we should all do it that way. And if it's not, then that person should say, okay, I did my experiment, now I'm going to come back and do it the way you're all doing it. That kind of an approach is critical if we're going to go forward. And so, yes, I think clinicians need to be involved, because if they're not involved, it's very unlikely that they're going to change their behavior.
Excellent. Well, we'll take questions for the second session and continue now, Jack.
Okay, very good. So if we go into the second session, again, you'll see in that first slide, we talk about 4 foundations for building this doctor engagement. And again, we're going to go into more of these in depth in subsequent sessions, but I think it's important that we don't just stop with laying out the problem, but begin to think about, so what are ways of building this foundation? And the first, I think, is, and I was alluding to this in the question and answer period, clearing the air and building trust. Clearing the air, sharing perspectives, and valuing the differences. You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about this as I was preparing this morning. There's an organization in the United States, and there was a really fundamentally flawed relationship between the doctors and the organization. And they had tried many things. And the CEO basically came up with kind of one rule, which actually got pretty well implemented, and that was, when you have suspicion of someone's motives, or you think they're not doing something which is going to actually be helpful, to just, before one claims that they're right and judges, just simply to assume that their intentions are positive. It may not feel positive to you, it may feel all wrong, but we don't have to ascribe all that negativity to their intentions, because we easily go there. We go right out to challenging who they are and what they really believe. So I think it's what we're trying to do here is, okay, they see it differently than I do. Does that mean they're bad? Maybe there's something in it. So the first thing is to clear the air, share perspectives, and value the differences. The second thing we'll talk about is responding to basic, legitimate needs that doctors express, and for that matter, all clinicians. If I'm working under conditions where we would all say that's a legitimate need and it has not been adequately addressed, I think it would be hard to think of doctors then being sufficiently committed to spend extra time and so forth, investing in things which, you know, heretofore they certainly haven't been required to do. I think if doctors are going to really upset the way they do things now and engage and really run the risk of losing something that they think is a really great way of doing something, they have to really believe that it's urgent that we all do this. And I know many of you are saying, I mean, what evidence does it take? We've been talking about it for many years. But I want us to, as we go through this, I want us to think long and hard, have we really made the case compelling? And most importantly, do the doctors in your organization think that it is urgent? And when I say urgent, I mean not tomorrow, not next month, today we must face the music and do this work. That's what urgent means. Doesn't mean we're going to go broke, but it does mean we have to do this now. We all believe that, or at least a broad and deep group of clinicians believe that. So if they don't, chances are it's not going to happen. And then finally, again, I want to come back to this, being clear about when you tell doctors we want to engage you, what are we really telling them? And can we be more clear and explicit so their expectations about what that means are aligned with the reality? So I just want to say a few words about each one of these. So we go to this clearing of the baggage. You know, again, the baggage, it does undermine the trust and engagement. I mean, how many times have you been trying to lead a discussion of a group of doctors, clinicians, and you'll ask a question, and you know there are many bright people there who have lots to say, and they won't say anything. Or they'll say it in a way where you know it's just kind of a very superficial kind of going through the motion. To me, that's all evidence that people are basically withdrawn. And what withdrawn means is they just don't trust. They don't trust that it's worth their time. They don't trust their ideas will be listened to. In order to get to the place where we can actually start to do the work, we have to clear some of that air. And I think several years ago, I landed on an exercise, which for me has never failed. I think the trick is you do need strong facilitation, and the facilitator shouldn't be from either of the groups that are engaged in the dialogue. But basically, if you have a group of doctors and you have a group of managers, and you divide them into two, like with like, and each as a group answers 3 questions together. Okay, so doctors would be answering the same questions, but as a unique group, managers as a unique group. And 3 questions: how we see ourselves in this relationship, our strengths, our weaknesses, what we contribute to the situation. How we see the other group, how we see you, and the same attributes, strengths and weaknesses and all that, contributions. And then how we think you see us. When we think of you, we think you see us in this following way. Each group makes the list, and I would say successfully, maybe you have a total of 30 people in both groups combined. I wouldn't have more. And then once those lists get made, they're shared without any discussion. Each group gets to see the other's list, and they review the items, and they can decide which they agree with, which they think it doesn't fit for what they believe is so. And finally, if they don't even know what's being referred to, they can just put a big question mark there and say, we need to understand it, because we don't know whether we agree or disagree. We don't really know quite what you're talking about. And so when you start to go through those issues that people didn't believe were accurate, or the things that they didn't understand, what's interesting is, and as you'll see, is that what we do in any kind of what we do in these relationships over time results in others having impressions of us. And sometimes that's unhelpful. We may not even be aware where those impressions are coming from, but through this exercise, we begin to understand if we're seen as not cooperative, there are things we're doing that are leading people to say that. And we have a choice to make as to whether we want to change that or not. So I think if you go to the next slide, you'll see, as it says here, the most useful insight the participants take away is that really, if they are contributing in some ways, unintendedly, to having these negative impressions about them, they have a choice to make. Do we choose to give up? Because you'll find out what the behaviors are in the exercise. People will tell you, these are well, how could you say that? Well, because when we observed that, that's what we concluded. Oh, okay, you have to hear that. You can't tell people they can't feel that way, because that's the way they felt, and we help to create that by behavior. We have to begin to think about choosing behaviors which will create a different dance, so to speak. So again, people can begin to take responsibility and choose different behaviors, which are much more consistent with being helpful. But of course, this is not building trust. What it's doing is it's creating the pathway for trust to be built, where we can begin to make and keep commitments. But this clearing of the air and understanding how we have all helped to create it, and I think in any therapeutic kind of helping relationships, I think clinicians know, the first step to really making an improvement is we all have to own our piece. And that's what this is helping people to see, that we're all contributing. I think that's number one. The second point I wanted to make around this foundation is this, the old adage, that people won't care about you until they know you care about them. It's just a fundamental thing about investing in relationships. And so, if we're asking doctors, to be engaged at this point, is it because we truly respect them and we care about them and we're trying to improve, yes, the performance of the organization, but also the professional lives of these clinicians? If they believe that, that's one thing. Or is the message, well, we're asking you because, frankly, we tried everything else and we figured this couldn't hurt? That's not exactly the kind of invitation that will open people up to really feeling cared about, which therefore would make them feel like they want to contribute. And the other thing that I think you've really got to pay attention to, and this is not, again, putting doctors on a pedestal, but is there scant evidence that the trust cares about the doctor's quality of practice life? And where I think that and if that's the case, and whether it's accurate or inaccurate, you'll find out where those perceptions are coming from. Do you start to begin to look at some really legitimate and fundamental things that we can begin to clear up, which will make their life more doable, more sane, where they'll have energy to devote to the things that are really critical for them to be thinking about? I think that's important. So, as you see in the next slide, this is a true story where I did work in a trust in the United States where the doctors were being asked to contribute, but what came up initially was, but you ask us to contribute, but the fact is every Monday we come, and we've said this a million times, we show up in the theater and there are not adequate numbers of scrubs on a Monday morning. And how many times do we have to say it? It gets better for a little while and then it goes back. Well, that to me is the kind of issue that if we're asking doctors to engage differently, we should be cleaning those things up. And I don't know what the issues might be in your trust, but I suspect there are some chronic issues that have not been resolved for the doctor's satisfaction, where we would all say it's legitimate. And it could be, if you're feeling like, that they are not entitled to that, well, then we're not going to do it. If we look at it practically and say, if this is priming the pump, let's go out there and prime the pump. And that's what I'm really talking about, is really helping people see you do value them and that you want to make this work for them as well. So then the third point we said we were going to talk about is the need for change urgent? Okay? Has the case been made in the minds and in the hearts of doctors that this is a compelling issue and requires their professional experience and time? And that not only is it compelling, but that it's urgent. As I said, not next week, today. And if you look at that scale balance there, you look at resting in those two areas of the scale, because this is the human mind, and when we're asked to make a change, we all do this. We weigh. You've heard the expression. We weigh what's the cost and what's the benefits. On the one side, if I'm going to be asked to change something that I like and it's predictable for me, that's a lot of pain and uncertainty in that. That's very dramatic, and I give a lot of life to that. But then there is this other thing, which is the way we do it today. I mean, we all do it differently, and we're not aware about the cost because maybe we've never believed it, or we've never really seen it affecting patient outcomes or safety, because maybe we just think it's always maybe one or two bad people, but not really this issue of we need to make a fundamental change. Well, if you look at that balance, you're asking me to make a change, which is painful, and giving up something that works for me for a risk that I don't really, that's this lack of compelling argument. What's the risk? Risk to patients, risk to the longevity of the trust, risk to attracting great clinicians in the future, retaining them. What is the risk? Enough of a risk that it balances with what I do feel today, which is the pain and the uncertainty of the change. And that's what we're trying to help people see. And this is not made up or exaggerated, but if the people who are owning the performance of the trust, more the managers, are really concerned about something, and that the status quo does lead to a very negative outcome, how is that presented? Or get the doctors to begin to understand what this risk really is all about. And oftentimes it really is helping them look at some of the information you're looking at, helping them draw conclusions, looking at it not in a completely polished or finished or interpreted way, but helping them look at some data so they can begin to think, well, if I were sitting in those shoes, what would those data what would those data say to me? On that next slide, you will see a graph, and this comes from the people at Harvard again, School of Government that I referred to before, Ron Heifetz and others. And if you look at this very simple graph, what it says is if we're doing an adaptive change, remember, adaptive change, uncomfortable. People have high anxiety in this state. It says if we're going to be successful at carrying forward and coming through a change like that, we have to hold people in a certain productive range of distress. There's below what you see in the slides labeled as threshold of learning, people are just, they're not even aware of the problem. They're asleep. There's no real compelling reason to be involved. If their level of anxiety is above the limit of tolerance, then we'll see all kinds of, I think, non-productive behaviors, maladaptive behaviors, people not coming to work or people losing tempers and so forth. So the trick here is to hold people in enough distress that they engage, but not so much that they really become non-productive and dysfunctional. Now, first of all, there's the issue of titration, and I think what Heifetz would say is you just have to try something and see. And we'll talk about ways of turning up and down the heat, to test and see what do people need. You probably all have a good sense. I mean, in my country, I think oftentimes we need more heat. In your country, there may be, in certain departments, in certain specialties, in certain institutions, so much heat that people really can't cope much, and they are becoming dysfunctional. You need to think about that. And we'll talk about how to lower and raise the heat in just a moment. But what I'm asking you to do in a way is to get people to engage often means focusing and getting them to feel a certain amount of discomfort. And most people did not go into management and healthcare to make anybody feel uncomfortable. And so I think over time we've learned how to many times when there is going to be pain, rather than letting people experience it to some extent so that maybe they will say, boy, I got to engage, something's not right here. We oftentimes, if you will, put asbestos booties on those people to protect them from the heat. And then we wonder why they are not willing to engage. So I often say, if the managers are concerned by something and the doctors are kind of not aware of it, how could that be? Is it we're not exposing? Are we protecting them from the consequences? And again, I'm not talking about like grim consequences that would put anyone at risk, but more than giving people the sense of this isn't worth carrying on in the future. It's dangerous. So that yes, there's pain and change, but think about the pain and the risk of not changing. That's what I'm talking about, giving people that experience, not just intellectual, but helping them really feel it in their gut, whether it's looking at information, drawing their own conclusions, looking at some of the outcomes and how can we account for such outcomes when we have such good basic clinicians and doing some analysis around that, but helping people feel uncomfortable with the status quo so they're willing to dive and be uncomfortable, knowing that on the other side there's something which is much more stable and better for patients and for them. But you see, in both scenarios pictured in the same slide, disengagement because sometimes there's not enough heat, and also if there's too much heat, you get this turbulence and you get this constant kind of change fatigue. So this titration is very important. So if you think the situation is keeping you up at night, and others just seem asleep about it, they just they're not even in the way, I think you have to really start thinking about what are we doing to standing in the way of data. And sometimes I can tell you in my own experience, it's like, well, we don't want to upset the doctor, so we don't really talk about it. And so I wonder, are there certain things which are not really being put out in a compelling way? And I think we do need to demonstrate, really, to help people walk through a scenario, the cost of doing nothing, and how that may well exceed the pain of changing. And so the whole idea here is whatever is visible to you as managers and doctor leaders, it may not be visible to the frontline clinicians. How do you help them see and feel what it is you see and they don't? It's the fundamental question. So I mean, I think but I do think it's important to acknowledge, and I think again, I've seen it where heat can be too high, and there it's about making clear you understand and acknowledge the feelings, and including their frustration. And you have to really do a fair amount of empathy. And then I think there might be a technical solution which will get things going a little bit. When we have these adaptive problems, we try to do the simple things only. That, I think, has often been a problem. I can remember back, at least in the States 20 years ago, the adage was if you want to get doctors to engage, you buy them lunch. Well, if you believe what I said about adaptive change, a lunch ain't going to exactly do it, right? And so I think, again, but I think when we're dealing with people who are so overwrought, maybe there are some technical things which can give people kind of a toehold so they can begin to then do the more serious work as they begin to experience progress and kind of their self-efficacy in getting something to begin to move. Sometimes you as leaders can chunk out the work into little pieces so they can feel success rather than overwhelmed by a big project. Sometimes you can slow it down, add some resources. But if you're dealing with people whose intentions are probably pretty good, but they're just truly, the heat's got them burned and fried, then I think we really do have to slow it down, because in that case, going slower will ultimately lead to faster results, I think. Now, I think this final thing I want to talk about before we go to the Q&A, what does engagement mean to you? If I'm talking to a group now of largely people who have management responsibilities, and that could be doctors, it could be professional managers, it could be nurse executives, anyone, what does engagement mean? What does engagement mean to you? I have honestly been in organizations where people will tell me with a straight face, engagement, but we tell them what we expect them to do, and then they're engaged. And I do wonder what that, but I feel sometimes like I've had a stroke. But that's what people will say. Okay, so that's one extreme. Sometimes what we'll see, or people will say, we ask them for their input, and what's useful we'll take, and what's not we just basically throw out. We'll use what's best and do what we think is best. Well, that leaves, I think, what we said before, which is doctors feeling like they've invested their time, and a lot of good input goes kind of right down the drain. And then, of course, there's the flip side, because if doctors are asked their opinion, and we haven't really defined what engagement means, some doctors will feel, if you asked me my opinion and I told you, then why isn't that the decision that's being made? Why doesn't that show up in my life? Why are we still talking about it? And so I think that needs to be made more real. That idea about what engagement is obviously not something which can be achieved in today's world. So I think you look at where we can be around this very straightforward, we think straightforward concept of engagement, it's all over the place. And so I think this is a first step. If we look at the benefits of engagement, that's great, but what do we mean by it so we can all have that same picture in mind? So my last slide, if you look at this this slide, I think it's not only does engagement mean different things to different people, which we're trying to clarify so that we can come to a common definition, but I think in the future it does need to mean different things under different circumstances. Because if you look at this slide, you can see that when you think about some decisions, and I'm sure some decisions come down from government where this is the way it's going to be, that really there's no input. And sometimes whether it's a political crisis. So, I mean, I think we can do that sometimes when at least we're doing other things when there's opportunities for input. So there, as you say, it's just telling it like it is, and basically things have come up and we just got to get behind it and let's do it. And we can be empathetic and we can try to make it as smooth a transition as possible. But I think we just have to be straightforward with people. But then you'll see there's two other categories, limited and wide open. When it's limited, you focus on maybe we can't talk about what it's going to be, but we can figure out how we're going to implement it, and we're going to try to engage them in having some sense of control about how this thing happens. And then over on the right, we see wide open. This is where we don't have an answer, and we're wide open to the ideas where our clinicians will contribute them. And there you'll see, and we're going to be going over this again in the future, I am sure, you'll see reference to something called fair process. And fair process, when we can make a wide open attempt of engaging people, is where it's transparent, merit-based decisions, where we engage people, where we upfront tell them the boundaries of what it has to be in a solution, whether it's the timeline, a budgetary limit, where we tell them what's defined already, and we tell them the criteria that we need to establish for coming to a decision. And we create lots of broad opportunities for input, whether it's meetings or blogs or whatever those things can be, or networked phone calls, whatever can get people to engage in these conversations. And then people have to be clear up front also, who's going to make the decision? What's the process here? Whoever has that responsibility after all this engagement, they make the decision. But what's so critical is that everybody understands the rationale, because it's really true, and you'll see in the next page there's a reference to an article that I would like you all to get and read. Basically, people do care about the outcome, but if they feel the process of coming to it was fair, meaning transparent, criteria-based decision that we all can understand, we might say, it wasn't my preference, but I could see how that would be the outcome, and I can live with it. That would be a much better place. And I think most people, if they really felt heard, could go to that place much more readily. So it is about transparent decisions where you explain the decision. And then the last piece of this process, which we'll talk about again in a future time, is that, and if this decision, whatever this decision it means, that the expectations for how some groups have to do their work is essential in order to make this thing work, we have to close that loop too. So this means these are the new expectations, and we help people meet those expectations, but we monitor and we give feedback. It's not just basically a one-time message and then people are left to elect whether or not they're going to do it, because that puts us right back in the same cycle, which is if some people do it and some people don't, why would I even bother to come up with a better method when the goal here is to standardize? So I want you to think a little bit about your own experience of engaging. Do you have a common definition? Question. When we talk about engagement, are we all really even talking about the same animal? And if we are, how does it apply under different circumstances? And are we conscious about which of these categories we're in before we ask people to be engaged? So again, in any given circumstance, we can create realistic expectations. In that last slide, which basically really repeats what I had said before, which is in that article, which is from the Harvard Business Review, where they describe this thing called fair process. They truly make the case where, yes, people want what they want, the outcomes matter, but no more than the fairness of the process that produces them. If people feel it's fair, feel the process is fair, criteria-based, fairly applied decisions, where we've all had the opportunity to have influence, people are much more ready to accept that decision. I think it's something that I would ask you to all think about before we get together next time. But I would like to take a few more questions, and I know then we've got to close down.
Okay, thanks very much, Jack. Matt Wyatt has made some interesting observations, and that he suggests that people's desire to engage or not is driven by at least one of 5 different approaches. Physical, I can't do that. Social, I'm with them, not you. Moral, it's not important to me. Mental, I don't understand what you're talking about.
Right.
And emotional, it's got nothing actually to do with me. These kind of drivers, how do managers pick through those to get what they want, Jack?
First, can I have the 5 again? I was just jotting them down, just real quickly, so I can address them. So physical was the first.
Physical,
right?
I can't do that.
Yep.
Social, I'm with you, not them.
Yeah.
Emotional, it's got nothing to do with me.
Yep.
Mental, I don't understand what you're talking about. And moral, it's not important to me.
Right. Well, I think what we have to do is we have to really understand what people are feeling and start to try to have a dialogue. Because if that's the mindset people have, about I'm with them, not with you, or this is not my job, I can withdraw, any of those, I think people can feel the way they feel, and I think, again, we have to come from a place of acceptance because something has helped to create them to be the way they are. Judging them is only going to make it more difficult. But I think it could still be an opportunity for some dialogue about maybe raising the awareness of how is that perspective ultimately harming what's very useful, what's very important to them, and can they begin to see those connections? But I think that only happens in dialogue and not like in a one-time conversation. And I also think some of the people who can perhaps have those conversations with doctors are those who have over time been seen as more trustworthy, or certainly has being more concerned about the doctors and their feelings. So whoever's going to do the challenge or to help people look maybe with a more critical eye, it needs to be somebody who I think that they can hear it from. But the bottom line is we can rationalize our behavior around any of these. And some of them actually need to be addressed. I understand that. If it really is a moral issue or a physical issue, I can't do that. If those need to be addressed. But when you separate the kind of what's real and what's kind of thrown down as objections, I think we have to really begin to say, okay, we can stand on that ground, but what is the cost to our society? What is the cost to our trust? What is the cost to me and how I see myself as a professional over time? Because I know in America, and I dread to think that it could happen in other places, I mean, society is really beginning to question the motives of doctors. And of course, you've had, I don't know about in Wales, but certainly in England, they've had scandals over some of the times that we were there. That begins to erode a sense that doctors are really on our team. And that's not a good thing. So if we can, okay, we hold these 5 perspectives, that's fine. But let's also hold the perspective of the reality of where are we as a society with funding health care. And I know for myself, and I think for most people who are listening to this conversation who are not doctors, if we really have to deal with an issue of shortage of resources and redesigning the care, don't we feel that we would like to have our doctors involved? For doctors, it may be giving up a kind of a righteous place where they felt that was not their job. But, you know, I think we have to evolve and understand that perhaps that is one of our responsibilities. So, again, fundamental adaptive change, because for doctors to fully engage, some of them, they have to really think about, so what is it to be a professional? Because perhaps many years ago, being a professional was doing your thing and not being involved in the trust, because that could sully the works, and that could cause you to make decisions that wouldn't be best for patients. I think we need to critically examine all those assumptions. Now, they're hard, deeply socialized, adaptive change, but I think we've got to start talking about it. And again, some of the things that were identified here in each of these 5, I suspect some of them are real things that need to be addressed.
Right, well, I'm sorry that we're running out of time for questions, and perhaps that we might address some of these offline, because there's been some really good
terrific.
questions being
terrific.
So I think what's been very good is the discussion about adaptive change. Doctors are traditionally very good at technical things, and we've evolved from knowledge and skills towards looking at the emotionality of the way that we work and the way that we learn. It's become very clear that managers consider doctors essential to the change process, but in some ways doctors have developed a learned helplessness and a sense that what they've got to contribute doesn't seem to go anywhere. And part of that, from the feedback that we've had from some of our colleagues, is that they're very seldom asked what they need to look after their patients, and can someone help them with it. And perhaps that small first step might lead us into the kind of change that you're looking for. There is no doubt that there is need for change, and that it's clear and compelling and urgent. But the what and the how is very difficult, and people have different visions with competing priorities in terms of waiting times versus clinical need. And so I'm really looking forward. Thank you, Jack, for this seminar today. And the next seminar, which is Engaging Doctors and Quality Improvement, takes place on Thursday, the 21st of July at the same time, 4:30 to 5:30, and will be chaired by Wales's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Ruth Hussey. So thank you for joining us on today's seminar. And special thanks to Jack for you doing that for us. Please could we encourage colleagues within our organisations to attend. Please discuss the the content of these WebExes within your organisations, within your individual professional groups. Would be delighted to see feedback and hear feedback within the 1,000 Lives and the BMA. This is very important that we have this dialogue as we try to change the underlying culture within the NHS of Wales. Wales is the size of an English health region. We have the influence to affect what goes on in Wales for our patients. Thank you for joining today's call. And until our next session, it's goodbye from me, Phil Banfield, and the 1,000 Lives Plus programme in Wales. So thank you very much. When you close the WebEx screen at the end of the session, a pop-up window for the session's evaluation will appear. I'd be very grateful if you complete this form so that we can learn and improve from your feedback. And that should actually take us to 5:30. Thank you very much. Goodbye.